Well, good afternoon and welcome to Asia Society Australia and today's China Executive Briefing, Cooperating with China on Climate Change. I'm James Scullen, Program Director at Asia Society Australia. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations with traditional owners and custodians. Today, I'm speaking to you from the Bunrawong and Wurundjeri lands of the East Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you to the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for supporting our China Executive Briefing series. And I'd like to thank our project partners, China Policy, who prepared the most recent policy brief on climate change policy making in China that attendees would have received ahead of today's event. Building on from that brief that looked at the domestic policy tools at China's disposal to mitigate the impact of climate change, on today's event, we'll be broadening the lens to look at how China's climate change policy agenda works internationally and the prospects for cooperation with Western nations like Australia and the US. In light of simmering tensions between China and the West, climate change has often been cited as a beacon for bilateral collaboration. And just a few hours ago, we received encouraging signs from the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, with the US and China announcing a joint climate pact. We'll be asking our expert panel for their thoughts on these developments from the 26th COP and the prospects going forward for cooperating with China on one of, if not the most critical issue facing the planet today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Professor Zhang Xiliang is Professor and Director of the Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's also Director of the Tsinghua MIT China Energy and Climate Project. Professor Zhang has helped draft China Renewable Energy Law and has been leading a national carbon market research project which aims at assisting China's NDRC in design of China's national emissions trading scheme. Barbara Finamore is a senior leader and environmental advocate who founded the Natural Resources Defense Council China program in Beijing, the first clean energy program to be launched by an international NGO. Barbara helped to develop China's first energy codes for residential and commercial buildings, as well as policy development on fuel cell vehicles, energy conservation, and the first nationwide emission control regulations for China's shipping industry. Professor Howard Bamsey is chair of the Global Water Partnership and honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. He's a member of the board of the Climate Policy Initiative and Climate Works Australia. He was previously executive director at the Green Climate Fund and director general of the Global Green Growth Institute, as well as serving as Australia's special envoy on climate change. Our moderator today, an Asia Society Career Fellow, Dr. Elizabeth Thurbon, is recognised internationally for her policy-relevant research on the state and its strategic role in the economy. She's currently leading a 3-year collaborative Australian Research Council discovery project on the geostrategic drivers of East Asia's clean energy shift and its implications for Australia. For a full view of the expertise of our speakers, please be sure to click on the link we're sharing with you now to read their full bios. Throughout our panel discussion today, please feel free to submit any brief questions or comments in the Q&A box below your screen, and our moderator will endeavour to incorporate them into the discussion. Thanks again for tuning into today's timely program. It's great to have you with us. And Liz, it's over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. And it's just great to be with such a distinguished panel today on such a big news day. I'm joining you from Wongal Land here in Leichhardt in Australia. So I'd like to start by asking a big picture question about the Glasgow COP. We're obviously now in the dying days of Glasgow, but there's certainly still time for countries to surprise us with new announcements individually and collectively. And we've certainly seen a big surprise overnight with the new joint statement between China and the US, which of course we'll discuss soon. But I'd like to just start by asking each of our panelists to share your impressions about your own country's individual performance at Glasgow and what you think we might expect of your own country in these last couple of days of the COP meeting. Do you think that, for example, we might have any further surprises in store? And if I could start with you, please, Howard. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I'd like to think that there was a surprise in store of something like the US and China gave us all yesterday, but I think probably not. But I think if this COP has been, at least as I've seen it, has shown more progress than I feared it might, but not nearly enough, then I think the same is actually true of Australia's positioning in the COP. It has been certainly demonstrating greater engagement with the international agenda and a fuller appreciation of what's expected of it than was the case a couple of months ago. But of course, it's not nearly enough yet. And I think the big disappointment is the failure of Australia so far to adjust its 2030 targets. I think that's at one level understandable in a political sense, because it does reflect an election commitment that there would be no change. But the problem is, I think that we've had very negative political context, and some of the Australian government speakers, some of the representatives, the politicians, have, by the negative tones of their comments, have really set back what might otherwise have been an even more progressive move by Australia. So I think all that's a bit unfortunate, but nevertheless, Australia has now reached the mainstream of developed country activity. I think a very positive increment at this COP was the announcement that Australia will double its climate finance. That's very very good to hear. So I think in the mainstream, but not yet beyond it, with a lot of potential for still more to be done within the, I think, pretty well-known political constraints that exist here and that have existed here almost uniquely in the developed world, and perhaps anywhere in the world for the last 15 years or so. So overcoming that will take yet more time, but I think there's enormous potential for Australia to make a bigger contribution.
Thanks so much, Howard. Yes, and this point about investment that you make is so important. That is such a key to the shift, and we can come back to that absolutely. Barbara, if we could turn to you on the US experience and performance so far, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Here is my report card on the US performance at COP26. First of all, the US is back in the Paris Agreement. Big step forward from the previous administration, and the pledge that it made to cut US CO2 emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030 is a significant improvement over the Paris Pledge. The Carbon Action Tracker's new analysis says that this is almost sufficient. It's not quite sufficient to bring the globe into alignment with the 1.5 degree target, but it could be with moderate adjustments. So that's pretty good news, though there's plenty of room for improvement. And of course, getting congressional approval for implementation is going to be the key barrier. The US also signed on to a pledge to halt the international public finance for coal projects abroad, which is a big step. The US signed the deforestation pledge to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. The US, of course, has its own goals, including reaching 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. It has a new pledge to have the US aviation sector reach net zero by 2050, which is new. And of course, the US-China climate agreement, which we'll talk about today, in more detail. Climate finance is okay. The US has pledged to, it hasn't yet reached its earlier Copenhagen pledge of contributing to $100 billion per year in finance to poor and vulnerable countries. It has stepped up its pledge and now says it will provide 11.4 billion annually starting in 2024, and to double or contribute to the adaptation fund to the tune of $50 million. So this is all good. Again, not nearly enough. And the US has not signed on to a key sticking point of what happens after 2025. How does the developed world step up its assistance for adaptation and mitigation to developing countries to meet that 1.5 degree target? So that is still just a step on the way, but not on the minus side. The US did not sign a pledge to phase out coal domestically. It did not sign a pledge to join the shipping industry in developing green shipping lanes. This is an area I think I see a lot of potential for. US did not, surprisingly, join a pledge to phase out the sale of fossil fuel vehicles by 2040 worldwide and 2035 in the largest markets. So these are, I think overall it's a major improvement, but we have a long way to go still to meet these pledges and to become more ambitious. You asked a very interesting question. Can we expect any more surprises? I think if you look at the language of that US-China announcement, you're not going to expect any further surprises in terms of phasing out coal, for example, or ramping up climate finance. But there are hints that the two countries are working together on two of the other key sticking issues that remain in the climate negotiations, and that is developing the rules for reporting and tracking CO2 emissions. This has been a key sticking point for decades between the two countries in particular, but also perhaps we might see some progress on development of a global carbon market. But these are global issues that need to be agreed to by all countries under the terms of the Paris Agreement. So it would be a major success of the Paris Agreement if we were to get on board with those and the other remaining key issues.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and it's fantastic to have the US back indeed, and so many interesting points for us to delve further into as our discussion progresses. Thank you so much, Barbara. Xiliang, could I ask you for your report card on China so far? Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. So before the COP, the Chinese government has announced the major new climate goals. And also, I think the most important part of the new climate policy package of the Chinese government. And a very important, I think, a very important job for my colleagues at the COP is to interpret and explain the new climate goals and the policy, including what's the actions. So in this context, I think they are performed well. And also, I think a message repeatedly coming from the Chinese delegation is that it's not enough to just show ambitious targets, and the action is more important. So this is the message I heard from the Chinese delegation, and also the Chinese delegation also emphasized that the Paris Agreement should be fully implemented. So that means every party needs to honor his pledge. So the kind of pledge, I think, is important, particularly the financial support from the developing nations, and I think it's also very important for the fully agreement of the Paris Agreement, and to increase the confidence of all parties, particularly the developing nations, to take more action to address climate change. And also, I think China also plays a constructive role in the negotiation of the Article 6. And the Article 6, the global carbon pricing mechanism. So I think from the general speaking, I think the Chinese delegation performed well according to my observation. And of course, the U.S.-China have made a new joint declaration on enhancing the climate change action. So I think it's also a success. It's a big prize. It's a progress. So as I know, China and U.S. have been trying to make a new agreement on climate change, but who knows when it will be actually take place? But I think it's a very good time. So in the COP, both nations can release the declaration and on climate change. It also help the international community to have more confidence and to addressing the global climate crisis.
Wonderful, thank you. And if we could stay, Xiliang, on the China experience for a moment, because you made the really important point then, I think, that one of the key tasks is really for countries to communicate and explain the kinds of actions that they're taking. And of course, China has expressed an eagerness and is showing a willingness to be a global climate leader, and has of course pledged to become climate neutral by 2060. So as an economy that's still very dependent on fossil fuels, could you tell us a little bit more about the steps that China has been taking to meet those carbon neutral goals over the past few years, and whether you think that China is on track to meet that target?
Thank you very much for the questions. So I think China has how to say the President Xi just mentioned that, repeatedly mentioned that addressing climate change is not something somebody else requested us to do. So this is something China how to say the China willing to do. So China showed to do. So I think it's very much how to say reflecting the situation of the Chinese economy and the resources. And generally speaking, so the resources constraint is very strict. So for China, so over the past, I think it's largely how to say the carbon neutrality goal by the year 2060 is very much in line with China's how to say long-term development strategy, and reflecting the situation of China's the endowments of China's resources. So and for the past the years, I think China has taken substantial efforts, how to say, to pursue a low carbon economy and how to say lowering the contribution of the energy intensive and the carbon intensive industries to the economic growth. That means there is economic effort, substantial effort has been taken to how to say to the economic structure change. Of course, China also have how to say take a lot of action to how to say the development of renewable energy and also the nuclear energy. So to decarbonize China's energy system, which is currently dominated by fossil energy, and also I think China for the past decades, particularly the past 5 years, China also has attached great importance to the technologies such as the carbon capture and sequestration, the hydrogen technology, the energy storage technology. I think this is very much, how to say, serve the long-term goals of the China's carbon neutrality, to achieving carbon neutrality by the year 2060.
Thank you so much. And just to stay on the China case for just one more question, Xiliang, if that's okay, because I think that, yes, it's really interesting. China has put an enormous amount into new and renewable energies over the past few decades, and is definitely pursuing that significant change domestically. So could you just give us a little bit more insight into how international climate policy is made in China? So, for example, when it comes to international cooperation on climate, what levels of government are involved, and where do you think the key points of resistance to more ambitious international commitment and international cooperation might be? For example, do we see any particular pushback from particular segments of the government, or from particular segments of the business community?
Okay, so it's a great question. I just show my private personal observation. So I mean, I believe so. The China's international climate policy is made by the top leadership and the President Xi Jinping, and I think the policy making process. So usually the draft policy proposal should be circulated among the different government agencies, and also would like to to know to ask for also circulate among the local government, the provincial government, and ask them to give comments and suggestions. So something like that. But the final decision will be made by the top leadership and President Xi. And I would like to remind you, pay attention to another very interesting thing, is that the scientific community actually in China play a unique role. So in the climate policy formulation process. And particularly, and also in terms of initiating the climate policy and drafting the climate policy, and also interpreting the climate policy after it's released. So you see, recently, the Chinese government has released a climate policy package. So it's called 1+N, the policy. Climate policy pledge. Now, after the release of the two and most after the release of the two general policy documents, this is issued by the City Council and the parties committee, the Central Committee. Some experts give an explanation of the policy to the public. So I think is a very unique. Some of my American colleagues and also Australian colleagues sometimes admire me because we can make a really direct contribution. So in the public policy, in the climate policy formulation process, that means the Chinese government, Chinese leadership, very much, give a very much would like to the voice from the scientific community. I think I would like to share this information with you.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to swing back to the Australian experience. So Howard, thinking about the Australia-China relationship, China is obviously on its big decarbonisation drive. So how do you see this affecting Australian exports, especially coal? And I guess, how do you think that this new China-US announcement, the new China-US announcement might impact on the relationship between China and Australia, which is already pretty fractured in a diplomatic sense?
Well, Liz, I think in relation to the first question, that the future of Australian of fossil fuel exports, and particularly of coal, are more likely to be affected by the nature of the bilateral relationship than they are by this decision to accelerate the phase out of coal. Because accelerating the phase out of coal is something that's not going to be unique to China. It's going to be part of the landscape in all of the current markets for Australian coal. the fact is that although it's a sort of taboo subject in Australia, on the part of all parties, actually, not just the coalition parties, but also the opposition here, no one will talk about the detail for obvious reasons. But although that's the case, it's very clear that thermal coal is on its way out, and it will take a long time for that to occur or be completed, even if COP26 and other pressures and agreements do indeed lead to an acceleration, but it's on its way out. But so I think that's not going to be a big part of the relationship, that change. In terms of the bilateral relationship, I mean, we have a lot to offer each other still. I think there was, I hope there still is, a formal bilateral partnership on climate change between China and Australia that's probably suspended for the present, given the general state of the bilateral relationship. But this goes back to 2003, and it was at a time when there was a particular series of technologies that were of interest to China, which they thought Australia was implementing in a way that was appropriate for them. And that was on reporting, actually, to go back to the point Barbara was talking about earlier. That relationship, the technical relationship, continued for a long time. And over that time, the Chinese capacity became so advanced that after a decade or so, when the two parties met, China was offering more than Australia in a technical sense, and that's no surprise. So the relationship has changed, but we still have a lot to offer each other, I think, and I would hope that we would see, just as the announcement yesterday from China, the joint statement from China and the US shows a resumption of this globally critical relationship on climate. So I would hope that we could see, before too much longer, a statement about the resumption of the Chinese-Australia bilateral partnership on climate, which is at ministerial level. So I think there is a vehicle available if both sides want to operate it, but it does take both sides, and it does mean some adjustment to the current state of the relationship. I think it would need some adjustment for the resumption to take place, but if the resumption took place, then we see the real prospect that it could become a way of generally helping build back to a more productive partnership that I think both the national interest and the national endowments of both countries reflect.
Wonderful. Thank you, Howard. And yes, a window has opened very excitingly. Barbara, if we could turn to think about US-China relations for a moment, which haven't necessarily thawed since Biden came to office, but I think that the joint statement overnight is certainly going to raise hopes for a new era of cooperation. So do you think it's possible for the US to separate climate issues with China from the broader issues of technological competition, of trade tension, of decoupling? Or do you think that climate might be used as a bargaining chip among existing points of conflict?
This has been a key issue in discussions between the US and China. When John Kerry first went to China, he had the strong position, which he's maintained, that climate is a global issue and it can and should be separated out from other areas of tension between the two countries. But in the spring, China's response was no. Climate change could only be considered in connection with all of the issues on the table between the two governments. That said, the US and China nonetheless issued a joint statement in April about collaboration on climate change that was rather detailed. And now we learn that the agreement that came out today has been in the works for months, that the two countries have had 30 virtual meetings, as well as a series of in-person meetings. And I think this reflects not only the intense nature of the discussions between the two countries, but also the need for both sides, the two main negotiators, Tsinghua and John Kerry, to go back to their governments and make sure that this approach is not going to run into other difficulties. What we're seeing is that, yes, climate change can be an area of cooperation between the two countries, and it is, as we see in today's or yesterday's for you declaration. I do not think, however, that this will be the harbinger of a new era of collaboration between the two countries. As it was with the Obama administration, I believe that climate change may be one of the only areas where the two sides, where it's in both countries' self-interest to collaborate. Now, you asked whether climate change can be or was used as a bargaining chip in reaching this agreement. This is a major, or has been a major concern among many in the US government who are not in the climate change space, and many analysts, US analysts, who were afraid that John Kerry would give up something, soften US position on key hot button issues in order to gain an agreement such as this. I don't think that's happened. And we'll see that very shortly, because we also learned today that the virtual summit between Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden may happen as early as Monday. And unless we see a real softening of US positions on hot button issues, which nobody expects, I think you can safely say that climate change was not used as a bargaining chip, but that both countries have been working hard to find common ground and recognize that it's in their own self-interest to collaborate on specific issues related to climate.
Thank you. Yes, and if that meeting, all eyes will be on that meeting on Monday, I am sure. So, Howard, if we could come back to Australia for a moment, because previously you had indicated, and quite rightly, that Australia and China really do have quite a long history of cooperation, collaboration on talking about climate and climate technologies. So where do you see some of the concrete areas for collaboration going forward, if we think about it being operationalized? For example, are we most likely to see collaboration on investment, say in Australia and in the region more broadly? And what do you think, obviously there's the diplomatic obstacle, but what do you think are the main obstacles to collaboration between our countries in the next few years?
Well, Xiliang and I were both engaged with our universities on a very interesting project, I think, that before the pandemic, that still has some really intriguing, fascinating prospects. I believe if we can get it moving again, and or others, because there were many on both sides who were interested, could get it moving. And that was really in relation to the availability in both countries, probably perhaps from different sources, but availability of green hydrogen, which could be which could be used in different ways in industrial processes. Particularly, we were thinking in terms of steel. And there are many dimensions to that, including investment, because although it might look as if there's a sort of zero sum to this, it isn't the case. One possibility was that green hydrogen produced from the vast renewable resources in the northwest of Australia, where iron ore is currently mined and shipped to China, that the green hydrogen could be used in various ways for some processing of that ore. So that's the sort of thing where I think, it immediately turns attention to the question of investment, and there's a whole backstory there too about Chinese investment in Australia and vice versa. But I think there is real potential. In other words, that's one example of possible collaboration that could benefit both countries, investors in both countries, and could, make a real contribution to the global climate response. And just, Liz, you'll be aware, I suppose, just to make clear that these examples can work. This example is not just fanciful, but these areas of collaboration can work. As you, I'm sure, know very well, one of the early solar technologies that went to huge scale in China was originally from the University of New South Wales. So it can work.
Absolutely, absolutely, it can. Thank you, Howard. And Xiliang, I know that this is a project that you've been in collaboration with Howard as well. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to what you see as some of the key areas of cooperation between Australia and China in that particular space, or more broadly. Of course, green hydrogen is so exciting.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think, Barbara just mentioned that, and Barbara and you also mentioned the China and the US just have a joint statement on enhancing climate action. So, and although the general relationship between China and the US is not good, so I think the situation is similar, to the Australia and China. So I think, so maybe Australia and China can also do something together. So and collaborate together in the field of climate change. So because the US China can do that, so the US China can do this, and we have reasons that Australia and China can also do this. So it's a general logic. So, but of course, it's very much, it depends on the decision making of the top leaderships, but from the scientific community, just Howard mentioned, we are working very closely together for a long time. So as a matter of fact, so there is a good history of US, China, and Australia, China collaboration. So on climate change. So I think from the past, China is really benefit a lot from the collaboration. So from the US, Australia, and China collaboration, and Australia also gave a lot of support for China's technology development and public policy, climate policy making. But now, apparently now the situation, now the collaboration stopped. So I think it's very, really bad. So I very much hope and China and Australia can learn something from the United States, because you are alliance of the United States. Maybe you can learn something from the United States. Although the general relationship is not so good, but the US can still, can collaborate with China on the climate change. So because it's the interest of the two nations and also the interest of the whole society, of the whole world. So this is, I would like to say something. I think regarding the specific the areas for the collaboration, so there are just Howard mentioned, there are many areas we can work together. For example, the green hydrogen and the green steel and the carbon capture and sequestration and also the direct air capture and sequestration. And I think the Australia have open a lot of land. So and how the renewable energy resources is also very good. So as for the direct air capture and sequestration, so I think you have a very good potential to develop and demonstrate so this kind of technology. And so if now, so the China, how to say, import a lot of oils from the coals and from Australia. Maybe in the future, China can export hydrogen, green hydrogen, so from Australia. So it improves the quality of the trade. And also, I think the China and Australia can work together. So in the climate policy formulation, for example, China, I think in the early years, China learned from Australia about the carbon price and the mechanism, the carbon tax, and the price program is very much encouraging in China. Australia have already carbon tax, but it's also big, how to say, support for the China carbon pricing policy formulation and development. But now the situation is different right now, and I hope maybe Australia can learn something from China. You can see China work very hard to introduce a carbon pricing mechanism, and particularly I think it should learn from the United States to work together with China on climate change.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and this question of the carbon market is something that I would very much like to come back to in a moment. Barbara, if I could turn to you for a moment, because thinking about these areas of possibility for cooperation, but also competition, I guess when Xi and Biden meet, maybe Monday, maybe a little bit later, it looks like climate will obviously be very high on the agenda. And I'm just thinking about some of the challenges to cooperation going forward. And perhaps, we've just been talking about the role of technological cooperation. Both China and the US obviously are increasingly competitive, very competitive in green technology. So what do you see as some of the obstacles to deeper cooperation, collaboration? And is tech competition, tech competitiveness, one of those areas in this particular space?
I believe there's a very strong role for both collaboration and competition. I think this joint declaration has done a very good job of highlighting areas where both countries face similar challenges, but collaboration would not damage the competitive position of either country. It has a process for getting to concrete results. And I'll give you a few examples that I think help to navigate the types of obstacles that we would undoubtedly see if we were to have the type of collaboration that we saw in earlier administrations. The Obama administration, for example, had extensive cooperation between the two countries, especially under something called the China-US Clean Energy Research Center, where the two countries agreed to develop and share intellectual property together on green technologies. I think that would be very difficult to move forward with today. But what we're seeing in this agreement is really a focus on sharing experiences, sharing policies, sharing best practices. This is the kind of thing I did with my organization for 30 years in China. It's very, very powerful. The most powerful area of collaboration, of course, is agreement to cooperate on methane reduction. China didn't sign the Global Methane Challenge that was spearheaded by the US, but and one of the reasons given was there wasn't a pathway forward for how it could get there. Well, this agreement has that pathway forward, with the two sides even doing some research together on how to capture methane emissions, but mostly sharing experiences, coming up with detailed national action plans, setting meetings where they're designed to perhaps come up with joint policies and standards. So I think this is very, very promising, because methane is 80 times more powerful than CO2 in the atmosphere, though it's short-lived. Reducing methane emissions right away could give us the time we need to achieve those deeper cuts in long-lived CO2 emissions. So that's one example where I think it's very promising. Another, I was very pleased to see when the areas of collaboration were listed that things like maximizing the social benefit of this energy transition was listed. I've long believed that that's one of the major obstacles to decarbonization, is ensuring that people are not left behind who are in the fossil fuel industries. And so that's an area where I think both countries can profit from collaboration. I also noticed things like Dr. Zhang mentioned carbon capture, utilization and storage, and direct air capture. Both of these are listed as areas of collaboration between the two countries. But also there is the very, very important areas of collaboration on developing new policies to help decarbonize the electricity sector. Both countries really are grappling with this right now, as we've seen from the recent current energy shortage in China. But they're going to collaborate on policies for integrating ever higher amounts of renewable energy into the grid, coming up with policies for ensuring distributed generation of renewable energy, and energy storage is encouraged and brought closer to where people live, and also transmission policies that help to balance supply and demand. These are crucial in both countries for the energy transition to move forward. And finally, I was very pleased to see a working group on US-China enhancing climate action in the 2020s was included, because this continued engagement is going to be a crucial way for overcoming obstacles such as misunderstandings in what people are trying to achieve in the climate space. Having these agreements just be on paper and not move forward the way that they should. I was very pleased also to see that the working group will seek input from the private sector and also from civil society. And I think that's essential in order to ensure that the concrete results, that the strong implementation of this highlighted in this agreement actually happens.
Wonderful. So many possibilities for collaboration there. And indeed, and on the methane agreement in particular, and I know that's something that Australia needs to look at as well. So I'd just like to remind the floor that questions are very welcome in the chat. We're coming up towards the end of the session, so if there are any burning issues that people would like to raise, please do feel free. If we could move back to the Chinese case, to talk about Xiliang, in Chinese policymaking circles, we're now seeing obviously this great orientation towards international collaboration on climate change, certainly in terms of the setting of goals. But I'm I'm wondering about collaboration on international policy efforts. So, for example, China recently launched a carbon market. We've spoken about that. Do you think that we can expect this carbon market to work with other carbon markets in the future internationally? For example, is there a plan to link? Oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, so I mentioned that. So the COP, the international carbon pricing mechanism or the trading or the market-based mechanism. So it's a bigger topic. It's of the COP 26 negotiation. So I just mentioned China will play a constructive role. So in making, we will have a deal on the Article 6. So that is, I think, at least China intends to make a deal. So in terms of the negotiation of the Article 6, so highlighting China will really support to create a global carbon market. So as a university professor, I strongly support. So eventually we will have a global carbon pricing mechanism or global carbon market. So we will be largely help the nations to increase their ambition. So of the NDC, the nationally determined contribution, and help the international the world to achieve the temperature targets. So China has already launched the national emission trading program before pilots. So in regions, and during, I think, because I involved in the development of the national emission trading program, so I know the international communication is really important. So because we learn a lot, so from the EU, the ETS program, from the California, the ETS program, and we even at the early stage, I mean, we also learned experience from Australia. So I think now the collaboration is really important, not just creating, a global, a carbon market. I think it's very important for helping other developing nations to create an emission trading program. Then there will be increase the possibility of the linking of the emission trading program. I think in this context, I think the US, China, Australia can help other developing nations to create an emission trading program. It's very important. Of course, the advantages of a linked the global carbon market. So it's obvious. So and it could be minimize the cost of mitigation and increase the possibility of achieving a more ambitious international global temperature targets.
Excellent, thank you. And yes, this question of developing country assistance is really critical for all of our countries, I know. Now we are bumping right up against time, so I have a final question that I'd like to ask each of you, and just your quickest reply. It's a hard question, I think, having to choose just one thing. But if you could just see one positive development in climate policy, domestically or internationally, in the short term that you think would make a really significant progress towards mitigation, climate mitigation, what would that be? If we could start, let's start with Barbara.
It's very clear to me. The single most important next step is for the US Congress to pass the Build Back Better Act, which is $555 billion for climate. This is the largest climate investment in history. Now, Speaker of the House Pelosi was just in Glasgow today saying that she expects the bill to be passed next week by the 15th. maybe that's wishful thinking. Maybe there's some deal in the works that we don't know about, which would be wonderful. But without that legislation, it's possible, barely possible, for the US to reach its climate targets, but very, very, very difficult. And I want to say that the chief climate person for President Biden, Gina McCarthy, just went to the White House from my organization, which she led for a year. And I was so impressed by her commitment to not only climate action, but climate justice. And I know that that's going to be a key aspect of any action the US does domestically. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Xiliang? We're missing you there. I'm sorry, you're on mute.
So I hope there will be, agreement. So on the Article 6 negotiation. So since that, so we can take steps to create a global emission trading scheme. So
Thank you. Short and sharp.
I also hope the deal. So I also hope the U.S. deal on climate change can be passed on the Congress.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Howard?
Well, Liz, I'm really tempted to say all of the above because I think what Xiliang and Barbara mentioned is vital. Can I just add one thought, though? I mentioned that the transition away from fossil fuels is a taboo subject here in the political class in Australia. But both China and the US as well have very difficult task in front of them to deal with the stranded assets that will be so apparent and which have economic and more political importance, and with the changes in employment that will be required, the adjustments to employment. This is a common issue for all of us. I think to some extent our governments are all hesitating because it's such a difficult issue politically, particularly. I think some work, if I could imagine that magic moment when the three countries could work together to find some good practice that might help all of us in this really vital task, then that would be that's not in itself an earth-changing moment, but it could be very, very useful.
Thank you. And it's been an absolute honour and a privilege to discuss these issues with you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I will hand over to James to wrap us up.
Thank you, Professor Thurbon, Professor Zhang, Professor Bamsey, Ms. Finamore, for taking us through the potential areas of mutual collaboration between China and the West today. In a statement made overnight in Glasgow, Chinese chief negotiator Xie Zhenhua remarked, "Cooperation is the only choice for both China and the United States. By working together, our two countries can achieve many important things that are beneficial not only to our two countries, but to the world as a whole. As two major powers in the world, China and the US shoulder special international responsibilities and obligations. We need to think big and feel responsible. We need to work hard to promote world peace and development. We need to actively address climate change through cooperation, bringing benefits to both our two peoples and peoples around the world. Let's hope the two nations can build towards the progress made overnight in the COP and build towards tangible climate action." To understand more about how China can cooperate with the West on climate change, in New York, the Asia Society Policy Institute runs a dedicated initiative on US-China climate cooperation. To read about that project, please click on the link that will appear in the chat below now. Thank you again to the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for their support of our China Executive Briefing series, as well as our project partners China Policy for compiling our series policy briefs. Coming up at Asia Society Australia, we're launching our inaugural Melbourne Asia Game Changer series next Thursday. After casting the net wide across the country, we received an excellent response from the community, nominating their Asia ambassadors who make a positive impact on Australia's relationship with the region. Scan the QR code on your screen to register your place for what will be an enjoyable evening hosted by MasterChef Australia judge and host Melissa Leong, and shining a light on those who make Australia's relationship with Asia richer. A final thank you to the members of Asia Society Australia for your continued support, and I hope you enjoyed today's event as much as I did. Thank you again for all attending, and look forward to seeing you next time here at Asia Society Australia. For now, it's goodbye and thank you.